right, so Cliff from AT&T is going to come up to the stage. This next section is called Wisdom of the Clouds. So these will all be 10 to 20 minute max, roughly 15 minutes average, to share a key topic. And again, when we talked to these people, we said this is a conversation about the Fortune 500 type adoption of cloud. That means something different when you're talking about security, when you're talking about whatnot. But as Cliff comes up, the short subtitle of his is Why Telcos Will Rule the Cloud. They've obviously been the ones that have acquired the most. They've been the ones that have been around the longest and have both huge successes such as AT&T and huge failures by some others. So I'll let Cliff come to the stage and say thank you to AT&T for sponsoring this.
That's a little bit bold. Because when Andy said, well, why don't you talk about that, that was basically, I said, can we change it a little bit? Because it's a little bit too bold for us. So I'm going to change that topic a little bit and talk to you about who will rule the cloud. Because at the end of the day, that's what we're predominantly concerned about. As an enterprise deliverer of cloud services today, it's really how, who is the one who's really going to rule that cloud. So Andy, basically, Gartner has a lot of research that goes into this, so I'm not going to speak to the credibility of this, but Gartner's been doing the CIO surveys since 1999. It's probably one of the longest running surveys out there. But when they surveyed there were about 2,000 respondents across 36 industries in 41 countries, there were 4 technologies that most CIOs were concerned about. That's in 2013 and beyond. The first one being, move back there for a little bit. Okay. Analytics and business intelligence being the first one. Okay. Second one is mobile technologies. The third one being cloud computing. And the fourth one being collaborative technologies. And this was supported by, there you go. I have to be a little bit more patient with this clicker. With Forrester. When they looked at enterprise architects, they surveyed enterprise architects, and what they found out, if you look at the technologies over the next 5 years that will prevail in the industries, what are the revolutionary technologies and what are the evolutionary technologies within the next 5 years that's going to be impacted? Business intelligence, number 1 in there. Okay, mobile technologies, another thing in there, and cloud computing. And when we talk about cloud here, for the sake of AT&T, we're going to talk about infrastructure as a service, storage as a service, compute as a service, platform as a service. We're not necessarily going to talk about software as a service for at least for this argument. So this is the cloud tug of war. On the right-hand side, you have the telco companies. Okay, back in 2011, the telco companies were going to say, oh, we're going to rule the cloud because we own the network, and because if the network's there, if we build the cloud, people will come. Now, is Amazon a network provider today? They're not. But from a market share perspective, they're the ones who are ruling the cloud right now. And so there's a lot of content providers out there, a lot of hosting providers, like a Rackspace, that have a significant value that they're delivering to the cloud. So you've got basically these two organizations. And why is that? Well, on the one side, there's companies like the telco companies that's going to talk about, well, we have the stability. We have a history of stability in delivering cloud-based services, so therefore come to us. But history knows, and basically what's happening in the marketplace today is the innovation. It's what's driving people towards the cloud. It's what people are doing in the cloud. It's what developers are doing in the cloud. That's right, driving applications onto the cloud and essentially gravitating towards the Amazons of the world. So that's a dilemma that we're facing today. What are the disruptions that's happening in the cloud? Andy spoke to this. I'm not going to belabor the point. Okay, there's a lot of OpenStack basically is creating that same level of disruption. But if you look at VMware today, right, with their vCloud and Citrix essentially looking at Cloud Stack, you're seeing a lot of movement in this area that actually people are essentially able to utilize the clouds more effectively. I'll tell you a little history. In our second release of our cloud compute services, we actually came up with an IBM based offer. That failed miserably. Our third release, we went with VMware. Why? Because at that time, when we came up with the third release of our compute as a service, VMware owned 80% of the enterprise business for virtualization today. It made sense for us to actually use it on that platform. Multi-cloud applications. So Chris was talking about this. They're building some proprietary application within their organization today that can take advantage of multiple clouds. I'm an old telco guy, so how many of you, just show of your hands, remember least cost routing in the long distance voice world, right? A lot of you do, okay? Many organizations today are essentially developing applications that can least cost route to the cloud. The key there is how can they make these applications? I can't name some of these organizations today, but Chris had already mentioned they're developing these applications today. Some organizations today will essentially build these applications almost similar to a middleware type situation where they're going to sell that as a software as a service. So then companies, enterprise companies can say, well, you can choose the cloud for Amazon because maybe they've got a special going on today, or you can choose the cloud at Rackspace, or you can choose the cloud at AT&T. And like what Chris had said, is not everything goes into the cloud, but the more applications you can deliver in the cloud, the better it is. Cloud mobilization. I'm seeing many people with tablets today. Many of you have smart devices. The critical piece there is what is cloud able to do for these mobile devices? And as more computing resources are happening on these tablets and on these devices, that's going to be very critical. And then finally, software. We know that Salesforce.com is doing many things today. There's so many software that's going resident on the cloud today. And as these softwares are pervasive within our organizations, where licenses are essentially done as a service and a utilities-based platform, this is also going to create a significant disruption in the cloud. And with everything that's going on today, what's next, right? There's so many things happening. So Dr. Tazu Shirvani, he's basically a professor at the Cox School of Business in SMU. And he basically put companies into 4 quadrants. And this is basically a company like AT&T is what we're challenged with today. On the one quadrant, you've got basically the Napa Valley. These are companies like Big Pharma. You need time, you need processes, you need a lot of research before you can actually launch a product out there, right? For safety precautions, for risk aversion, et cetera. So telcos are kind of like Napa Valleys, because we've built a history, over a century of history of processes and stability that it takes a long time for us to sometimes deploy something in the marketplace today that's very stable, that people can rely on. Then on the one side, you have the Silicon Valley of the world, that the speed by which innovation needs to happen is very critical to the success of any organization. But what's happening in the enterprise today is, can I get the best of both worlds? You can see the same dilemma that's happening in the Apollo group today. Can't I have the best of both worlds? Can't I have agility while having a stability of a very process and a lot of methodology associated with a company that I'm dealing with? When you look at enterprises today, many enterprises are not jumping all of their applications into the public cloud for the simple fact they're risk averse. So what ends up happening, most enterprises today are either going to be pragmatists or conservatives. They're going to be very cautious on what they put in the cloud, because control is going to be very key in terms of what they're going to allow in that public cloud. Most enterprises are going to look at something that's flexible, simple, but highly secure when they're looking at cloud today. So how do we combat this Napa Valley, Silicon Valley? Okay, within AT&T today, we have the 3 AT&T Foundries, one in Plano, Texas, one in Palo Alto, and another one in Israel. These AT&T Foundries' simple mission is, how do they actually implement an idea? Ideation to essentially products in this thing happens within a 9-week period. So we basically, AT&T sponsors hackathons, basically using our cloud. We get mobile developers, all developers of all kinds, to come into these foundries. Okay, and what happens is once these ideas are vetted out, there's a fast pitch that goes on. And when we feel that an idea of all these developers makes a lot of sense, we're going to fund them. We're going to put some seed into them to develop a proof of concept. The whole point there is you got to be able to fail fast and fail cheap. When you fail fast and fail cheap, you're going to learn from that. And whatever you learn from that, you're essentially going to come out with some sort of beta, which is going to be phase 2. And then phase 3 would be basically essentially commercialization of that particular product. That's one way that we're pushing innovation for an organization, the Silicon Valley-like for a company like AT&T. Many organizations today are doing something very similar. Then we layer on that our century-old AT&T Labs research. Highly methodical, very process-oriented, but very forward-thinking. In AT&T Labs, we're thinking of stuff that's happening that we think is going to happen 10 to 15 years ahead. Okay, a patent's released a day and a half on average within AT&T Labs on some idea that we have. So again, Napa Valley, Silicon Valley, how do you make these things work? Because the cloud market today, okay, is not as big as what Gartner's saying. Our organization's excited about it, but it's not as big. Okay, but what we know, it will get there. And so here's what we're basically, our vision of where we see things happening, okay, is if you look today, pull out what's the closest computing device that you have with you today? Your smart devices. Your smart devices, basically, if you have business intelligence on these devices, you can make decisions real time as quickly as possible as you can, right? But what happens is the processing power of these devices are still somewhat limited. But what if the processing power of these devices are somewhere resident in the cloud? That's going to be very compelling. What if applications are resident in the cloud? So with AT&T today, that's why we made some significant investments in acquiring USI Internetworking about 8 years ago. Because they have SAP, they have Oracle, they have Microsoft. There's a lot of applications that we can reside on the cloud. So that's one way you can actually use that. And now, what you're really breaking it down to is you're going to have tethered users and mobile users, okay? And what happens there is that's when the network's going to start to matter. Because when, back at about 1.5 years ago, there was an article that was written out by Boris Rinsky. He's a Silicon Valley technologist. And what he said is why telcos won't rule the cloud. And his argument was very legitimate. Because what he said was just because you own the network doesn't mean you're going to own the cloud. If GM built roads, that doesn't mean people will buy just GM cars. That's to a point. But what happens is as enterprises start adopting the use of the cloud, as more and more of your production applications, mission-critical applications are going to be resident in the cloud, what AT&T believes is that eventually the network's going to matter. Because there's stuff that's happening on the internet today that becomes very, very critical for many, many organizations today. And if you become highly dependent on your production traffic and your mission-critical traffic on the cloud, you will have some challenges associated with that. So what we're trying to do is deliver best of both worlds today. Okay, the API is going to be king. So when you look at how AT&T is approaching it today, on the right side, if you look at the service stacks that we have an open stack. On the left side, you got more proprietary work in VMware. The hybrid model for the cloud is where we see this going, and most enterprises are adopting this today. You have application users, you have your client, your IT staffs, and you've got your corporate data centers. Most of this today is connected together predominantly by some sort of a private infrastructure, an MPLS-based infrastructure. But much like basically the Apollo Group is doing today, what you can do is offload many of these applications into the cloud, whether to actually accommodate for peaks that you've unanticipated, or some other use case like Concur Technologies, where they're actually using the cloud as essentially a disaster recovery solution. Your primary data center basically handles all your computing resources, but in the event that something happens to that primary data center, within 15 minutes they can shift all those images to a cloud provider like AT&T, and essentially within 15 minutes, whatever was happening at the primary data center can essentially be replicated now in the secondary data center. So it's not a question who will rule the cloud, it's who can rule the cloud. There's so much stuff happening right now. There's a lot of disruption that's happening right now. But the key here is whoever's going to win this battle is the one who's going to be able to harness the velocity that enterprises are starting to adopt the cloud. You've seen how basically how the Apollo group has started to adopt the cloud. We see many more enterprises doing that. And the critical piece for us is what these things are going to be doing in the next 5 years. That's all I have. Thank you.
Videos. Thank you for being a part of the inaugural BigCloud event in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We'll see you next year in March. To all of you, thank you. To our sponsors, thank you very much. Have a great night, everyone.